And it looks like it's recording now. Thank you all for joining a meeting of Vermont's Environmental Justice Interagency Committee. We're excited to have you. Here are our relational community agreements. So we're just going to ask that folks read them to themselves and then just give us a thumbs up when you're, just to let us know that you agree. Sounds good. I think we're ready to move on. The agenda is also in the chat, but here's what we're hoping to cover. We'll do some updates around the law, and then we're going to give a presentation on the, or a recap of the civil rights and environmental justice complaint response, like the history over time of what's happened to tee us up for your discussion. We'll take a break, do public comment, and then you all will have some time to yourselves to just discuss whatever you'd like. It'll be unfacilitated time to work together, and then we'll end with next steps. Let's do thumbs up for the agenda, and then we'll do thumbs up for the minutes after. All right, cool. And then thumbs up for the 4/28 meeting minutes. Awesome. All right, let's get started with updates. So a proposal for adjusting the Vermont EJ law timeline was included in S325. The AC, the Advisory Council, submitted a letter to the General Assembly, and this will be discussed in the June 10 joint public meeting. And then now we're going to do the recap. And the purpose is just to make sure that we're all on the same page. If you could advance the slide, please. Thank you. I'm going to try not to talk too much, but I do want to just make sure we're, again, all on the same page. So March 15, 2024, you all submitted your first annual Civil Rights and EJ Complaint summary reports. The Advisory Council had a wonderful public meeting where they worked to develop some recommendations, and then they submitted a response back to you, a unified response back to you in May. And then you all submitted a unified response back to the Advisory Council addressing each one of their recommendations. And the main recommendation there was to have a single intake system for civil rights and environmental justice complaints together for members of the public. And then A&R, Agency of Natural Resources, as the lead agency, submitted a response as well, explaining that civil rights complaints processes and EJ complaint processes need to be separate for due to the federal civil rights requirements. And then in 2025, you all submitted your reports, your complaint summary reports. 2 advisory council members, Rich and Mariana, worked together to submit their own response to you all. And that response basically confirmed their interest in, moving forward with trying to define the EJ complaint, like what an environmental justice complaint is. And then they also shared a desire to further explore the anthropocentric framing. They identified that as a concern in the EJ law. And then you all submitted a unified response back that, shared agreement and basically that you supported and were interested in additional support from the advisory council. And then there also was a recognition of wanting to also further explore the anthropocentric framing. And then between May and August, you all kind of worked together to produce a work plan to make progress toward the advisory council's, previous recommendations. And then 2026, this year, you all reviewed your EJ complaint intake process work plan in the January public meeting. And then you all had a follow-up public meeting in February where you reviewed the modifications and the edits. And then you all submitted your summary reports on time. And then the advisory council actually discussed the civil rights and EJ complaints and started to talk about the definition, like what an environmental justice complaint could look like in their April meeting. And then on May 7th, 3 advisory council members attended office hours to actually build out their recommendations. Those 3 advisory council members were Mariana, Rich, and Matt. And then they ended up submitting their own recommendations to you all about what an environmental justice complaint definition could be. And then we also just wanted to make it clear that that report is, or that response is their own response, and it doesn't represent the, the entire advisory council. They haven't had a chance to review it together and come to consensus on it. So that's a very detailed recap of everything that's happened. Wondering if folks want to just stop and connect. And Janet, it looks like you would like to come off mute.
Sorry, is my hand up?
No, it's not.
Oh, what'd you say, Kim?
Oh, it just seemed like you perhaps wanted to say something. I was following your facial expression.
Oh, but okay. Well, I do have one question, because this happened before the Land Use Review Board was seated, but the idea of everybody using one complaint avenue or whatever, and A&R suggesting that we couldn't do that. And yet it seems like we're still working toward that. Am I misunderstanding something?
Is that something you could clarify, Carla?
Yes. So what Kim mentioned earlier is that the advisory council requested that a centralized unified intake system be created for intaking both civil rights complaints and environmental justice complaints. And then the response that the Agency of Natural Resources provided several years ago included an explanation of why it is that those 2 subject matters should be handled separately. So yes, it makes sense in terms of the framework to have an intake system for environmental justice complaint, but because of the rigorosity of the federal government's requirements regarding management, intake and triaging of civil rights complaints, the response that was provided is that civil rights would be handled separately, but that we would be working towards a unified central intake system for environmental justice complaints.
I see. I misunderstood. I thought the summary was that we couldn't work together to have an EJ complaint system. So thank you.
Yeah, sure.
I think, Amy, did your hand go up?
It did, but Carla answered it. It was just that, like, we're still working towards one unified EJ intake system, but not the joint. Thank you.
Any other thoughts or questions about any of this?
I'll just say, Kim, that you are remarkably perceptive.
Well, we know each other now, Janet. Yeah. Thank you for sharing. Let's see who has their hand up. Abby.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. I think this recap was helpful, and that clarification was also helpful, but I will admit I'm not sure kind of like where we are in the process of working on a centralized EJ intake system. Is there a kind of a subgroup or a working group, or is it just something I haven't been paying enough attention to?
Yeah,
I'm just
good
curious
question.
where it's at.
Yeah, so good segue. But we can stop sharing, Julia, if that works for you, and then I can answer. Thank you. Yeah, so where we are today is that we're going to give you time to digest the 3 advisory council members' recommendations, and then give you a chance to, through circle process, talk it through. And then you'll also have time specifically to discuss their recommendations and also how you would like to move forward, like come to consensus on how you'd like to move forward in actually implementing your work plan. So you're more than welcome to discuss maybe a subgroup, but that's kind of what today is about. Does that work? Okay, great. Any other questions, thoughts? Okay, cool. I'm gonna share my screen. And then let's see. Is this coming up for you all? There's kind of a lag with my team.
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay. Okay, cool. All right. So this is the actually it looks like a slide isn't here. So I'm gonna stop sharing again. My apologies. And put in the chat the discussion questions, and then also I'll put in the chat the advisory council's response. Okay. So their response is in the chat, and then I'm also going to put in the chat the 3 kind of discussion questions. Okay. So they're in the chat. The 3 questions are, what were your takeaways from the report response? What elements of the response would you like to explore further? You know, that really means whatever it means to you. You know, are there sections that resonate? Are there sections that you feel like you'd like to lean into? Are there things that you don't understand or want more clarification on and want to explore? And then the third question is, how would you like to see the IAC proceed from here? So those are the 3 questions to mull over. No pressure to answer them all, but we're hoping that you can speak to some of this in the circle process. And then I will also include in the chat the order of the circle process.
Kim, I was wondering if before we enter into the discussion, if maybe you would be willing to share slide 8, because it is a helpful summary of the advisory council's their most recent response.
Yeah, I do want to do that. I just want to get all this in the chat first. One of my slides isn't there, and so just gotta do this real quick. So get deleted. All right, so there's the first flow of the circle process. So you have it. All right. We may be missing a couple of folks, but we'll get you in there. Okay, now I'll share my screen now that you have everything and can process as we go along. All right. That work? So again, three advisory council members developed this draft definition of an environmental justice complaint, and it does require further advisory council review and approval. So an EJ complaint alleges a disregard or neglect to any of the principles of environmental justice. People or communities that can file a complaint include people who have allegedly experienced obstruction to fair access to environmental benefits, disproportionate exposure to environmental burdens, and a lack of meaningful participation, information, services, or protections related to the EJ law. So that's a good outline. The next slide will look at their entire definition in full, but just want to leave this up for folks to process. And Janet, we see your hand.
So is that your interpretation of what we see on the 3rd page of their response?
Yeah, it's a high level explanation or summary rather. And then yes, the next slide will actually look at the entire definition and the content that they included. Does that answer your question? And do you have other thoughts?
Let's see what the next slide shows.
Yeah. All right, is everyone ready to move on? I can't see everyone, but just want to make sure. All right, cool. So I'm not going to read this one, but give you all time to process it. We'll give us one more minute just to process, and then we'll see if anyone has thoughts. Yeah, initial reactions, and then we can move in the circle process. Janet?
So it's interesting because the previous slide doesn't really speak to the the second part of the first paragraph. And the second part of the first paragraph, including any lack of care against the sacredness of Mother Earth, the interdependence of all species, and the right to be free from ecological destruction. I mean, those are all wonderful. But I don't think that the way that the EJ law is constructed in our statutes, in our state statutes, speaks to any of that. And so I'm just wondering how to incorporate that. And your previous slide doesn't incorporate it. And I wonder if that's why.
I can take the
Does that make
first
sense?
part. No, it does make sense. I can take the first part and just from attending the office hours, I can speak to a part of their thinking. So, you know, there was a recognition that there are several environmental justice principles, and environmental justice principles are, you know, the foundation of the law. And so with this interest in defining what an environmental justice complaint is, there's this added interest that the advisory council has continued to have, which is to, you know, look at the framing around the law, the anthropocentric framing. And and so that's the grounding for this. Principle 1 is the principle that you see there, and it's one that isn't really discussed a lot. And so that might be why it feels kind of foreign. So for them, this is an attempt to at least bring this into conversation. They haven't gotten as far as to describe process for what that would look like. But these 3 members do, I think in their report, actually talk a little bit about their interest in at least moving forward and discussing this with you all. So it's a draft to reflect this evolving interest in talking that through. So that's the reason why it's there. Juliet drafted the slide, the summary slide. So I can also, I see your hand up was up. I don't know if you want to go back to that slide and talk about it.
The purpose of this slide was to just provide a brief paraphrase of what was otherwise like several paragraphs of text. And so by the intention of that bullet where it says a disregard or neglect to any of the principles of environmental justice, the intention of referring to the principles of environmental justice was to capture all of the principles. It just so happens that their full text definition as it currently stands highlights a couple of definitions that they specifically would love for us to focus on a little bit more in the framing of the EJ law. So the intention was not to obscure those principles, but rather just to keep the slide text brief, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. Janet, your hand is up again.
So I guess what I'm not understanding is that those may be principles in the broader context of societal discussions of environmental justice, but they are not in the Vermont statute. The statute defines environmental justice and does not include any of that. And so that's why I was and so I don't know. I guess it's something that I would like some legal counsel on, whether we can do this.
Yeah, and I see Carla's unmuted. And just like to provide again some more like reset maybe expectations for today. This is just the starting place to discuss where you're at. And what I will say is that the advisory council is on the same page with you, like recognizes, you know, that there may be tension in trying to have the discussion. So again, today is really just more about getting your concerns, you know, out there, but also trying to find a way to meaningfully at least have a kind of thought partnership with the advisory council around the subject overall. Let me, Carla, go ahead.
No, I unmuted accidentally.
Oh, okay, got it. So that's kind of the intention of the first paragraph. It's just, hey, we recognize that principle one actually captures some of the, you know, thoughts that the advisory council has around bringing this topic into discussion with you all. And then the second paragraph is kind of intended to explain more of the specifics around the complaint. And then the third kind of sentence or section of the definition, it felt really important to them that this actually names that this should be flexible. Community input and feedback was also something that they'd like in the future to be involved in this process. And then also flexibility would be important to respond to implementation needs and support that you all need as well. Juliet.
I just wanted to offer in response to what Janet said about how the current EJ, the definition of environmental justice under the law doesn't include or emphasize some of the things that are included in that first paragraph. The advisory council, of course, we've talked a lot about the interest in revising the environmental justice focus populations definition. However, the law does offer a repeated opportunity for any of the definitions under the law to be revised. And so this last sentence here where it says, this draft definition should remain flexible and continue to respond to EJ law implementation, ... Part of their intention of drafting the definition as they did was to include terms that could potentially change in definition under the law. So they use the term environmental justice and environmental burdens and environmental benefits and meaningful participation, which all have particular definitions under the law that are subject to change as our understanding of the law continues to evolve. And so I just wanted to offer that although there is currently a definition of environmental justice, there are some advisory council members who don't feel like that definition necessarily resonates. And so there's opportunity for that to continue to evolve as time goes on.
Thanks for that. And I'll also add that, you know, this kind of draft definition came about after a lot of thought. And so there's definitely, you know, more work to be done and more consultation needed. But again, this is just kind of a beginning place. Let's see, Claire.
Yeah, I just maybe a procedural question, but I know that the statute says that these like core definitions should be reviewed like every 5 years. Do we have a sense of when that we're counting that like 5-year benchmark? Would that be like from passage of the law in 2025, in which case like this, I mean, we could do it as often as we want, I think, but if we were thinking about like a formal process, if that would be helpful, it seems like 5 years from passage of the law at least would be like kind of around now, which would be timely with like this proposal and or next year potentially.
Technically, the law, the first deadline, quote unquote, I'll say, for reviewing definitions under the law, the first deadline was December of 2025. And then it was for every 5 years from there forward. But as you can recall, we weren't necessarily in a position to review the definitions at that time. So I think that once folks are in a position where they're ready to review definitions and provide a recommendation to the General Assembly, I think we could determine a frequency from there forward.
And then Bob.
Yeah, I'm just in paragraph 2 there. I wonder if we should consider adding as a result of agency action, inaction, maybe consider adding conscious legislative decisions for unfunded mandates. In other words, they make mandates on agencies, but if they're not appropriating money for it, it could lead to the conclusion the agency is being inactive when really their hands are tied because there's no appropriation to do the work being tasked. So it's just something that kind of clarifies that when a requirement comes out that we can't meet because of lack of funding, that's a conscious decision on legislative part to do that. And that kind of is embarrassing from the state perspective because we're acknowledging a problem, we're consciously underfunding it or not funding it, and yet we still put it out there as though we're interested in solving the issue. So they can't all be true. If it's really important, we need to fund it. If we're not going to fund it, let's not make it part of a law until we have the funding available.
Thank you, Bob. Other initial thoughts? Okay. Oh, yeah, Amy?
So I'm sorry, I had to hop. Did I miss the circle process?
No, you didn't miss it. We're about to move into it.
Okay, then I'll wait.
Okay. All right, so we kind of have a grounding into this. And I'd like for us to kind of pause, zoom back out, and focus on the discussion questions for the circle process questions. So they're intentionally drafted this way to, again, focus more on pulling what your takeaways are from the content that you see. You know, sharing and communicating what elements of the response you'd like to explore further. You can interpret that however you'd like. And then also just some, you know, high level examples of how you want to move forward together as a group to explore, to advance your work plan, whatever that looks like. Does anyone have any questions? All right, cool.
I'm happy to go. It looks like I'm first.
Yes.
I'm ready. Okay, thank you. Well, the first thing I was going to ask about, so we're talking about the definitions. The other, like, what feels like an elephant in the room for me is the intake process and how we're going to build that together. And so I see that you just put the work plan in, which is, I think, what talks about that. It's not letting me click on it as a link, so I don't know if that's a me issue. But like, what are the next steps on that? It doesn't feel like we've really talked about how we work on building that intake process together. And that feels like a really important, the definition doesn't matter if we don't have a way to use it. So I'm like, I keep going back to how are we going to build this process? How are we going to put it together? So that's one piece. There's a note in this response that I really appreciated very much, because this is how I've been thinking about it too, which is that it should not fall on the shoulders of Vermonters to have to sort out what type of complaint they are filing. To me, that is the most important thing in here, because I've been thinking a lot about this whenever we submit our reports, but there's civil rights reports, there's EJ reports, there's a general, I just have something that I'm mad about to report that might not fall into either of those things. And right now, unless you've, even a civil rights complaint, unless you submit it in the exact way that you're supposed to submit a civil rights complaint, it doesn't necessarily go through the process in the way that it should. So unless it gets flagged in the exact way that you were supposed to do it. So there's a huge impetus on a person to understand how to submit a civil rights complaint by agency to even get through that process. And this really compounds that for me, where now there's two potential big specific definitions of what might trigger a specific type of complaint. And then the whole category of I'm just mad about something else. And unless they go through the right process, none of those will get filtered in the right way. So I think within we've talked about developing a process that that would work across state government. I still think that's incredibly important, but then if the burden isn't on the person, who does that burden land on and who's going to be reviewing those things? How does that happen? Feels like a whole nother can of crazy that gets opened. But a really important one that if we're going to get this right, you need to be able to submit you need to be able to submit anything, and it needs to get filtered through these two lenses to make sure that if it does trigger those things, that they get triggered in the right way. Does that make sense? That's the piece I keep getting stuck on.
Great, thank you. Janet, would you like to go next?
Okay. I guess that I think there are two elephants in the room, Elizabeth. Because I think the other one is how environmental justice is described in law. Maybe there's three. There's also what Bob said, the unfunded mandate. You know, it feels huge to try to reconcile all this. And I also feel nervousness about the fact that we need to have community engagement plans in about a year. And I don't know how we're going to move forward to get all of that done. Makes me anxious. I don't know. Is that what you're looking for, Kim?
No, actually, you touched on each question. So it sounds like what you're saying is you'd like to today figure out how to actually kind of balance the community engagement plan deliverable and also moving this forward in a meaningful way. Yeah, and then you're naming, your concerns. So I think there's time today to discuss those things and make a plan for how you substantively move forward. Yeah. Dave? Is Dave on the call? Sure. No, I don't. Okay. Grace, you're up next. If you'd like, by the way, you can skip if you don't feel ready to share and we can come back to you.
I just have something really small, which is, I guess, something I talked about in our draft ACCD report, which is that, and this is like very specific to ACCD, but it might be relevant to other agencies, that we contract with CVOEO on fair housing complaints. So CVOEO is kind of like our external capacity. And I don't know how long that contract has been in place. I'm sure I could find out. I don't know why we did that in the first place, probably because we didn't have enough capacity. But my question is if that is the case with other agencies, how do we break down those silos and or figure out if it's more efficient? I don't know. I guess I'm brainstorming out loud. Is it more efficient to keep going with CVOEO, but is that compliant with the Civil Rights Act? And how do we sort of explain that and how do we make sure all the complaints are captured, I guess?
Great question. Carla or anyone else, do you have thoughts on this?
Hi everyone. So Grace, I think, the way to answer your question would be to develop a better understanding on what the dynamics are between your department and CVOEO when it comes to civil rights complaints, like what kind of internal dynamics exist. So is a complaint filed against your department? Does it go to you? Does it go to them? What kind of triaging? What kind of investigative process? Like all of those things. And that would be something that should be determined internally. Just to ensure that you are complying with your federal requirements. Because there's a whole host of requirements that come from civil rights, and it's not only Title VI. Title VI is the one that's contained in this law, but there are other federal civil rights requirements and regulatory requirements.
I guess, yeah, thank you, Carla. I guess one more thing is that we have our own, and this is unique to ACCD maybe again, but we have our own fair housing requirements because of our HUD and other federal funding. So like, I need to figure out more how that interplays together because, we put on fair housing trainings for all the developers that gets federal funding from us. But like, what does that really do? Is that compliant? Stuff like that. So need to figure that out more.
Mm-hmm. I tend to think that in order to understand perhaps how to tackle the environmental justice complaint intake system internally to your agencies and or departments, it's going to be important to understand what kind of infrastructure exists currently for civil rights Title VI complaints, because there may be infrastructures that you can utilize to support the intaking of EJ complaints that then could be elevated to the interagency committee. So I think having an understanding of right now where the structures exist and how they work for civil rights complaints may be a good place to start. I also want to mention that there was a timeline that was associated with the work plan that I put on the chat. And so when we have open time, we could look into it and determine, whether that order of operations still makes sense. But yeah, Grace, we can also offline if you have more questions about civil rights. But I think it's really important to touch base with your general counsel. And then CVOEO, like that contract, exactly what's the scope of it and how are complaints being managed.
Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Great question. Thank you, Carla. Maybe, I don't know if you spelled out the acronym, but just for folks who don't know that might be watching, if you could share that.
CVOEO is Champlain Valley Office of Economic Opportunity. So it's, I think they're federally funded. There's, regional offices. CVOEO is the Champlain Valley one, obviously. They provide a ton of, fuel assistance. I think Capstone is the Washington County one. Fuel assistance, housing assistance, training, education, just all the assistance to Vermonters.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, I don't think Elizabeth is on the call. So let's see, Amy, would you like to go next?
Yeah, thank you, Kim. Thank you for incorporating this process into our meeting. It feels good to practice. I have a few quick reflections. One, in terms of the takeaway, I feel really grateful for the AC members' time and attention on this. And I think one of the takeaways that I'm still feeling that has been kind of a thread through our meetings is I think the AC is like our untapped superpower. And so knowing that 3 worked on it, and I see in there that it needs to be reviewed and approved by other AC members. So just seeing that large opportunity for us to kind of like continue to build our relationship with the AC is really present. So that's not specific to what was in the text. Like Stephanie, I'm moving to my next point. That like Stephanie, I really am thinking a lot about the intake system and like the unified intake system. So I feel like next steps, we have an awesome work plan. Thank you so much for that. So kind of like, I'm excited to get into this work. I think that for me, it feels important to kind of think about our core work team, like our IAC core work team, as it relates to the lead agency. It feels really important to me to identify who the lead is going to be as that one intake. So can we do those two things in tandem? And the last thing I want to share is that when we first started working on this, probably 2.5 years ago, I had the opportunity to talk to the lead person in Colorado who has an EJ complaint system, who's intaking the forms, and the calls that they were getting, at least at that time, I forget what the number was, but the process wasn't perfect, but they had something in place. And so I want to remind us that we want to be thoughtful and intentional, but doing something, creating something is like our job. And they had one person to intake all of the forms and triage. So I just feel hopeful that we can do this. And I think that getting on the work, even without like perfect definitions and even without even knowing it's going to be a lot of work, I feel hopeful about it. So, okay. Thank you for listening to that.
Thank you, Amy. Well said. Bob, do you have additional thoughts you'd like to share?
Not too many. I think going back to kind of what Janet was alluding to earlier about the first paragraph and the draft definition that they came up with, to me, those are very aspirational, and I totally am on board with them. But I also think that the last one, the right to be free from ecological destruction, I'm totally on board with that. But just by our human existence and the use of chemicals in everyday life that we're doing, there's ecological destruction happening on every farm field that's potentially using some sort of chemical to enhance growth and protection of crops, but it's also killing insects and then some sort of other water runoff that then is doing something downstream of it. So I think we need to be careful in how we will never be free from ecological destruction, but we can try to minimize it to the extent that technology allows it and good reasoning allows for it and good laws allow for it. But there's always going to be a negative side effect of most of the decisions and actions that we take in trying to bring about the most good for the most people. But there's always going to be collateral damage, and we need to understand that. And using broad sweeping words as free from ecological destruction, that is the goal. But there are the realities, I think, that we then have to understand. Not everybody is going to be free of that. So nuclear waste has to get stored somewhere. The nuclear waste casks eventually leak. There's usually some sort of groundwater contamination. Chemical tanks, just like what they're going through with that chemical tank that's overheating, right? Those chemicals are terrible, but they're also used in so many things that we rely on every day. So there is going to be ecological impact, and we have to mitigate the damage that comes about from using it. So I think that's kind of an important thing to me.
Thank you for sharing. Okay, Abby, would you like to go?
Yeah, thank you. I think that I resonate with a lot of the comments already made. I think the new pieces that I want to contribute towards that may need further exploration or kind of like in response to what's been discussed so far is I'm bringing a desire for kind of sensitivity and consideration in a centralized intake process around how to maintain anonymity or protection of individuals, whether it's the individual making the complaint or a complaint that may identify an individual within state government. While we can, I think, acknowledge we have an incomplete and, undesirable process currently, like that triaging and filtering is happening internally to individual agencies. And I feel that there's some kind of like protection in that process that could be lost if we move towards a centralized system that I'm just not sure how to address. Relatedly, I know that within our agency, when there have been complaints of a nature made, at times human resources becomes involved. And so I'm just really curious how HR would be part of our centralized intake system, and like kind of like how that kind of level outside of an individual agency or department is addressed. And then lastly, and maybe this is kind of just by nature, there are certain programs of federal funding and federal agencies that require sort of a particular complaint process, and our agency manages some of those. I know we're not alone in that. It may not be of the environmental justice nature, but just sort of, again, recognizing that we may find ourselves in a similar situation of a Vermonter is struggling to figure out where and how they process a complaint if EJ is all centralized, but then all other complaints that, again, we are required to and desire to track are happening at the individual agency level. So again, I like applaud us to kind of like explore this centralized and improved efficiency and ease of use, but I just want to recognize that it's complicated beyond even just the EJ complaint arena. Thanks.
Thank you. Those were great considerations. Let's see who's next. Claire, would you like to go?
Yeah, thanks. I think so in terms of the discussion questions, one of my key takeaways I feel like is really related to what Carla just put in the chat about the AC's role being establishing the substantive principles, and then it being the agency's role, like work to translate those. And that really resonated with how I felt in reading the draft definition of, I think conceptually, it would be helpful, I think, to have a conversation directly with the AC to talk about some of the things that are coming up today. But that's kind of where my mind went, is like the way we operationalize this would be really dependent on our different agency jurisdictions and which components of that type of definition would apply the most to us. And I feel like that also impacted how I was feeling to your suggestion, Bob, about like adding language around like unfunded mandates from the legislature. Of I don't actually know how that would fit within that definition, because I feel like it may be true that we can't, the outcome of a complaint we receive is like, well, what's impacting our ability to make a decision about this or change our procedure, or is the fact that we have no resources or a mandate that's very specific. But it feels like putting that in the definition, I don't know, I have to think about it a little bit more in terms of like what we're striving to achieve. I feel like that was kind of my initial takeaway, was focused on reviewing that definition, which I was really grateful for those 3 members putting forward. I think it's already sparked a lot of good conversation. In terms of the elements of the response to explore further, it actually was related to an element of the response that I was looking for but didn't see, which were comments directly on the work plan we submitted. And so that was I think an area where I'd be curious to have more conversation with the advisory council of, is this work plan missing something, or should we really just kind of get started because it's comprehensive, which I think relates to the third part in terms of next steps, is just thinking about creating some space, and maybe we have it today, to think about forming that team and who makes sense, because I feel like some of what's coming up in this discussion, particularly like the issues Grace raised, we might start to flesh out when we get into phases 1 and 2, particularly around like comparing where each of our agencies are with not just EJ complaints, but like any kind of complaint requirement. Like I know the department, we have pretty formalized complaint systems for like our statutory requirements around taking in certain types of complaints. And it'd be really interesting as we start to flesh those out to learn more about ECCD's requirements versus others and kind of balancing like where we all lie on that spectrum. So I think those are the thoughts that come to mind right now. But yeah, excited to move forward with this work. And I guess that was my last takeaway, which I didn't mention, which I did feel like I appreciated the balance in the AC response of like, there's more to do here. And I think I saw a comment of like, we feel like this conversation's moving in a productive direction, which resonated with how I was feeling, even if it's moving relatively slowly.
Thank you. Jenny, would you like to go? It looks like Jenny's not
Jenny
on the call
had to,
anymore.
yeah, she had another meeting she had to go to.
Okay, no worries. Wanted to give you, Josh and Adam, a chance if you'd like to share your thoughts. No pressure.
Yeah, I can go. Because I'm still kind of new to a lot of this. I'm still kind of getting up to speed, but thanks for everybody who was involved with creating that work plan. That seems pretty solid. I guess like as I was reading it, and this may be an obvious question just because I don't know, but like in the meantime between like now and like the full system being built, which it looked like the target was like 2029. What's like the process like right now for someone to submit a complaint? Is it kind of just like super fragmented at this point and goes to any agency the person happens to send it to? So that was just like one thing that came to mind. And then like working for the AOE, the other thing that came to mind was like what would be kind of like a good example of a EJ complaint. Like if a school or if a family went to a school, let's say it was like built next to an industrial site or something, and they were concerned about air quality within the school area, maybe compared to like a wealthier area of the state or something like that. Would that be considered an EJ complaint? And would they go to the AOE to do that complaint or ANR, or is that kind of this like unified intake system that we're talking about right now that would go through that? So anyways, I mostly just have questions.
Those are excellent questions. Want to pause, see if Carla or even you, Bob, have thoughts in response.
Yes. In terms of the interim period, that is really a question that should be answered by each of the agencies. I can share what we have done at ANR. Just awaiting substance from the advisory council and also an alignment with the committee on how to move forward and the timing of things. Is we created an intake system for managing concerns, is what we're calling it. And it relies on a network of individuals that was identified at the agency from the 3 departments, the Environmental Justice Network. And if there are concerns that arise within the different programs at the agency that touch on either environmental justice because it's like verbalized as a concern, or there's we've had conversations with staff about the disparate impacts. So if there is conversation about disparity in impacts, that sort of like triggers an additional level of review. And then that takes that that concern gets directed to the lead for the Department for Environmental Justice. And then there's a meeting that's scheduled with me to discuss more with program staff what the elements are and how to solve the concern. And so sometimes that implies me having conversations with a member of the public or just with staff and providing guidance on how to address that. But again, it's very high level. It's predicated on the many conversations that we've had for several years now with the network on about talking and discussing environmental justice, the elements, what the core tenets are. And so my invitation would be for agencies to reflect on whether there's something that could be stood up in the interim so that at least there are answers that are provided, even if it's a recognition of the receipt of the communication and that the agencies are working with the advisory council to stand up a system. But it really depends on each of the agencies and what approach makes sense at this time.
Thank you, Carla. Amy?
I thank you for that, Carla, and also Josh, for the questions. I was just going to reiterate that I think at the Department of Health, we're kind of in a little bit of a standstill till there's a lead agency, because I've been doing some research on like how not EJ complaint protocols work, but I get pushback internally, not pushback, just kind of like we don't have any regulatory power. And the fact that the AC said that they want one intake. So I appreciate the invitation to kind of think about some in between. But I will say at the Department of Health, I've felt like we're in this like holding pattern until we as a unit move forward together, not that like, so I think I appreciate the and both, the kind of like, what are some conversations we can have internally for some things that we can do, but feeling very much like we're not in a place to do much without the lead of or knowing where that kind of like intake, that one unified intake system might be.
Awesome. Thank you both.
Great. Okay. And then Adam, do you have any thoughts?
Thank you. No, again, sorry, I'm just joining here to follow along as a member of the public with the EJ implementation process, but I have no comments so far, but I've appreciated hearing from everyone in there.
Okay. That's this is a good, we were going to stop for public comment anyway. Let me see if anyone else is on the call. Okay. Sounds good. I muted myself. I think it's worth taking a break. This was a great discussion so far. And we're pretty much right on time with the agenda. So let's take 10 minutes to regroup, get some water, food, use the restroom, whatever you need. And we'll see you back at 11:20.
Sorry, Kim. I think I was skipped in the circle process.
I'm so sorry.
It's fine. But I just really briefly want to reflect on the several folks who have raised questions about operationalizing some of the content that could be interpreted as aspirational. And so specifically thinking about, for example, the sacredness of Mother Earth, the interdependence of all species, or Bob, what you mentioned, free from ecological destruction. In thinking about the framework and the relative roles of the advisory council and the interagency committee, taking those concepts as not necessarily independently enforceable, like violations or triggers for a certain kind of review, or a rigid standard that would trigger certain process, but instead it those principles or concepts help us, the interagency committee, interpret complaints perhaps more broadly. Be mindful as we talk about and discuss the scope of what may fall under an environmental justice complaint versus a concern, if there's that distinction made. That there's an important consideration from the advisory council that this be interpreted broadly. And so stay away from narrow technical review, right? So utilizing those concepts and perhaps values statements as operational guidance, and perhaps interpret those in a way that conserves the core of the statement or the intent, but then allows us to tangibly manage the particular question that is being raised. So just wanted to comment that, the written text, there are multiple ways in which that text can be utilized. And it is my recommendation that we use the content as the basis for conversations that then may yield operational outcomes.
Thank you for that. Juliet, I also know that you had thoughts. Would you be okay with either sharing them in the chat or sharing them when we come back from the break?
When we come back from the break, sounds great to me.
Okay, and I see Jeffrey and Pike are on the call. We're gonna take a 10-minute break. Pike, are you a member of the public?
Yes, I am a member of the public.
Okay. Are you okay with, do you have a public comment?
I do. I can wait. It's
Okay.
a quick, more of a question than a comment, but yes, I do.
Okay. If you don't mind, we'll take a break and come back at 11:24, and then we'll take your comment. All right. Sounds good. Thank you all. All right, welcome back, everyone. Pike, if you'd like to share your question.
Yes, thanks for the opportunity. Unfortunately, I couldn't log on earlier. I saw on the agenda that a complaint was being discussed. I assume that might have been mine. So my question is are these being recorded and will these be available? Can I watch the video later? And if not, are transcripts available?
Carla's going to respond here.
Hello, Mr. Porter. This is Carla Raimundi with the Agency of Natural Resources. And the agenda was referring to a process that the agencies that are covered by the environmental justice law are discussing that would allow us to intake environmental justice complaints and resolve those complaints. So the discussion is not about a specific complaint, but rather about a process that the agencies are embarking on to develop an intake mechanism.
Okay, thank you for the clarification. I assume that all of you or most of you did receive the complaint I filed last week. As you're aware, there's no real process for consumers to file a complaint, so I appreciate you looking into that. I believe that someone from the Department of Health is on your task force or group. I think they can corroborate that there is a higher incidence of respiratory illness in the Old North End, and maybe Winooski as well, than elsewhere in Vermont. And Vermont has higher incidence of asthma and other respiratory illnesses than most other states, in large part probably because of a large amount of particulate matter, PM 2.5, that is being emitted from wood stoves across the state. But in specific to Winooski and the Old North End, the McNeil plant. I believe that the Equal Justice and Environmental Justice bill that was signed several years ago speaks exactly, or should speak exactly, to this kind of issue. You know, these neighborhoods are also burdened by pollutants from the F-35s. And if ANR is not going to consider environmental justice neighborhoods when it's allowing permits for something that exceeds or pollutes over 5 tons of PM 2.5, I'm not sure what this statute is supposed to accomplish. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Pike, for coming on and sharing. We appreciate you. Carla, do you need to respond?
Hi. Yes, you're correct. There is an environmental justice law that was passed in 2022 and started getting operationalized by 2 entities that were created in the law, the Interagency Committee, and this is this body, and then the Advisory Council, which is another body within the governance structure that the law created. And we are in receipt of your complaint, Mr. Porter, and we are preparing a response. So we will, very gladly engage in this conversation with you, but I just need a little bit of time to finish my response to you. I want to make sure that we're being mindful of all of the points that you raised, and we will get back to you. But thank you so much for coming here and sharing.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
No, thank you.
Thanks so much. Okay, a few things. One, Jeffrey has joined the call, so I'd like to introduce him. Jeffrey is the new policy and research analyst at the Office of Racial Equity and is going to be representing Susanna Davis, the director. So Jeffrey, would you like to come off mute and just say hi?
Hello. Hi, my name is Jeffrey Barshmana. It's a pleasure to be here. As it was mentioned, I work for the Office of Racial Equity as the policy and research analyst. I look forward to interacting uh, with everyone and learning more on how our office can help in these situations.
Thank you so much. Okay, awesome. So now let's move into your unfacilitated discussion. Juliet, I haven't forgotten that there are things you'd like to share. I just wanted to share my high level, like the things that I'm tracking. It sounds like there's an interest to discuss operationalizing the work plan and also maybe even taking a slight step back to talk about the feasibility of the unified intake system, or at least some considerations there. A lot of folks named the elephants in the room, and what I'd like to offer is that the advisory council they're aware of the elephants in the room, so they're with you there, and I'd like to encourage you all to explore how the advisory council can actually play a role in facing some of these elephants. A lot of you have mentioned very intentionally wanting to increase like thought partnership with the advisory council, collaboration, relationship building. And so this, like working on this body of work could be a really tangible way to do that. So I'd encourage you all to kind of think about next steps around that as well. Juliet, I'll kick it to you, and then we'll give you guys the rest of the meeting to discuss, and we'll just share next steps via email.
Thanks, Kim. Yeah, just thinking back to a comment that Abby made earlier in this discussion, mainly centered around this idea of maintaining anonymity, and protection for individuals who file a complaint, as well as the individuals, if there are individual, perhaps state employees against whom a complaint is filed. That was something that I've been thinking about a lot with regard to the EJ complaint process. And I just want to offer that for those of you who don't know, a part of what our unit does is obviously a huge part of what our unit does is the implementation of the environmental justice law, but we also work on civil rights compliance for our agency as well. And I would encourage any of you guys, if you're not familiar with the civil rights complaint intake process at your agency or department, to maybe talk to your attorney to learn more about how that works. I know that in general, the federal government requires for civil rights complaints that all agencies have a non-discrimination coordinator, and that in the case of our agency, at least, the non-discrimination coordinator, who is Carla, receives our civil rights complaints and then basically brings in investigators who are pre-identified and are also anonymous at our agency to investigate civil rights complaints from there. And so basically what I'm trying to say is there's like a whole communication system that we have set up where there's like a firewall between people. So if a complaint is received, it's immediately directed to our non-discrimination coordinator. People are not allowed to talk about the complaint if they've been made privy to it outside of, the non-discrimination coordinator, an identified attorney, and the investigators. And so there could be a possibility where, the EJ complaint system is designed similarly to a civil rights complaint system by analogy, where there's a EJ non-discrimination coordinator or something for all of the covered agencies who has a singular email and is the recipient of these complaints. And then they, as an individual or as a team, do the triaging. I know that this is part of kind of the idea that's come up in the past, but I would recommend, or, maybe thinking about how a communication system can be set up if anonymity ends up being a priority. And I think the question of whether or not anonymity is a priority is less for us to answer and more about the complainant. Do they want to be anonymous, or do they want to, of their own volition, be open and public about being the individual who has filed a complaint? I don't think it's up to us as agencies to make that decision on the behalf of someone else. But yeah, I think there's a lot of learning to be done by analogy of how civil rights complaints are handled. And of course, that we don't necessarily have to follow the same level of legal rigorosity. We could decide to do so. But it's really a question of balancing how do we keep the system transparent for members of the public and easy to navigate, while also, making sure that we're protecting people and their interests as they're navigating a complaint process. So I appreciate that question, Abby, and I just wanted to offer a potential way that maybe the issue of anonymity and protection could be solved.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to step back and let you all go from here.
Oh yeah, I love the suggestion of looking to existing systems that we have as a solution. I just want to note that, like, if one of the recommendations out of our internal processing system is actually needing to add like a new position to be that non-discrimination EJ coordinator role, I'm just like really sensitive to the fact that like we could develop a whole intake system approach through the implementation of our work plan that includes not only individual agency capacity, but actually additional kind of centralized capacity. And it's just giving me greater pause of like, what is the likelihood of being able to fund such a position? And I like your suggestion. It's just, I just want to be realistic about the infrastructure that we're actually going to have support and budget to build. So I just hadn't thought about that until you made your comment.
Oh, go ahead, Carla. And sorry, Abby, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
You didn't. You're fine.
Yeah, I was going to mention that is comprehended in the work plan. That conversation about budget and needs and resources is comprehended in the work plan. So those conversations, I hope we will have them in short order once we've identified, how we're going to move forward when we look at the work plan and the steps. Phase 0 would include developing a core team amongst those here to assess how we're going to move forward. And so it is very clear to all of us here that, we are working with certain constraints, and those should be folded into the conversation and then properly contextualized so that as we move forward, we identify the best ways to manage what we're being asked to manage under the EJ law in a way that is sustainable.
Yeah, and I was just to add to what Carla just said, I think, Abby, your point speaks to as we get into the work plan and move through it and come up with system recommendations, not just having like one approach that relies on a position that we may not be granted, but coming up with like contingency plans, like a ideal scenario versus plan B scenario and or just really needing to identify like not having this possession would prevent us from moving forward with the whole solution or, you know, that kind of discussion and whatever proposal we put forward. I guess, while I was already talking, I am curious, and I apologize for not having gone back to the AC meeting where they talked about our reports and looking at the minutes prior to this. But I was just curious from the ANR team if you guys could speak to whether or not the work plan was discussed at that AC meeting, either in office hours, when they were looking at the complaint reports, and that there's like relevant discussion for us to go back and look at, or whether or not like this would warrant. I know our June joint meeting already has an agenda, but a future joint meeting worth like having a further discussion with them about the work plan before we like dive into it, which I don't necessarily think would prevent us from developing a core team. Feels like those things could progress in parallel, likely, at least on our side. But just was curious about that aspect of our submission from March.
Yeah, they did not discuss the work plan. They focused a lot on just kind of conceptualizing and deliberating together. That was the first time in a long time that they kind of what's the word that I'm looking for? That was the first time that they were actually able to come around and discuss it. So talking about process and also evaluating your work plan wasn't something I think they're positioned to do at the time. And then the office hours were focused specifically on building out their thoughts and getting it down on paper, and also coming up with a plan to actually submit on time. So I think we're definitely in support of you all discussing the work plan together at another meeting.
Great, thanks, Kim.
I guess I'm curious, are there IAC members that are sort of feeling drawn to the core team role?
I can say I have been intending to reach out to our Division of Consumer Affairs and Public Information about, once we had a sense of, you know, if we're moving forward with like a task group or something like that, we do have a formalized complaint reporting system and procedures for utility related complaints. So I think to the extent we're looking to incorporate folks who have experience with this type of work, that could be valuable, but I can't yet speak to their capacity to engage. But it is my intention to broach the topic with them. Or at least, and then if not, like as a member of a core like working group, but folks who could be available at a resource as a resource at like critical points as needed.
I think that one of the reasons why I ask, and I'll just keep talking, is I don't feel that I have capacity to serve in that core team, and I'm just really curious if there are others that have both kind of knowledge, capacity, interest, passion on this subject, and if like we walk out of, or if we don't find that core team, like what's our what's our plan? And I don't mean to kind of call a question in an uncomfortable way, but I'm really just curious with all the simultaneous deliverables and focus areas, like where this stacks for people in ability and interest to work on it.
Go ahead, Janet.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Amy, same here. I don't feel like I have the capacity or maybe even the skills, and I kind of wonder if we need, like I'm trying to think who on my staff would be the appropriate persons or person. And because we're talking about a technical complaint system that would likely involve a website, configurations, or I don't know. I don't know. I don't feel like I have the capacity. And I don't know who the right person is from my team.
Yes, I was gonna mention that, Janet, that we're sitting here representing positions of our agencies, and sometimes we lose track that there are other folks within our agency that may have the knowledge necessary to propel this work forward and the capacity and interest to contribute. So that's always an alternative too, right? Is identify folks from our agencies who may have the capacity and interest in supporting this work moving forward. And then, the rest of us who are not currently do not have the capacity necessary to do that can, touch base with those individuals and, make sure that that representative capacity remains and the connection to the work remains. So I was just going to echo, Janet, what you mentioned.
Again, I'm just going to jump in because I think we're sort of selecting here for feedback. I can anticipate that if, at least in my agency, if I were to ask if anyone had capacity, they would want to have some of that task 0.2 items confirmed of role scope and expectations before bringing someone else in. So I sort of was imagining that the core team could have representation beyond the IAC reps, but that would some time needs to be spent kind of like thinking through what we're asking of people, even if it's a colleague or a member of our agency. At least that's my expectation. I don't feel like I can go to one of my colleagues and say, do you want to do this, when I don't have a sense of what the commitment would be.
That is always tricky. It's the question about the chicken or the hen. Did I say it right? I hope I did. It's sometimes starting with interest and then having the opportunity to discuss that individual's availability in connection with the other folks' availability may be helpful to frame the path forward and assign a timeline. I want to remind also folks here that there is an adjustment of the timelines that's, embedded in S325. And so there is time that has been envisioned already to be utilized for this purpose. And one of the documents that was provided to the General Assembly included mention of, if we're able to realign and adjust the timeline, we will be now more prone and have the availability to move forward items that have been on our queue, and this is one of them. So that's spelled out because there's going to be a freeing of resources in terms of the urgency, and the fast pace in which we have to move in order to cover all of the deliverables that we are moving forward. So namely, we're looking at the rulemaking and the mapping tool, and those are humongous deliverables, as you know. So that's gonna allow us for development of a more measured approach. And hopefully what that means is that we will be able to carve out time to do this engagement with the folks who have the capacity and ability to do that.
Amy, go ahead.
I was wondering, I think I have a question, two questions. One, I was wondering from Juliet and Kim and Carla, do you have any early ideas about your A&R's engagement in that team? Will it be similar to kind of like how you've shepherded along the other work groups? And then the other question I have is really about the lead agency or the home, and will that be part of the core group, or do we have ideas about where that might live and how to make sure that we have just the working relationship in terms of where it's going to live and how the work evolves? So those maybe are not meant to be answered in this space, just some questions that I'm holding. Thank you.
Go ahead, Grace.
Thanks. I need to hop off soon, but I wanted to respond to Juliet's question about sharing my community engagement plan brainstorm debrief that I had with the Credu unit last week sometime. I don't have my notebook with me, but I took 3 pages of notes and want to share that it was super helpful to vent and unleash all of my concerns and sort of experiences with the baseline spending report and how that had me concerned about this upcoming deliverable, and sort of take a more measured approach and get questions from Carla and Kim and Juliet about specifics about my agency and who I work with and how the agency is structured, and thinking about the hierarchy especially was really helpful, and who should be involved, who should you meet with first, and from that meeting what should you take, and how should it be framed, and especially they had a lot of helpful suggestions about framing it, and how to frame it as something that the agency can sort of show off and use their skill set and their expertise to, make a comprehensive and strong community engagement plan, as opposed to framing it as here's another deliverable that we have to do for the EJ law. So I really appreciated that help and the space to voice my concerns and get some calm and helpful feedback, and also the opportunity for Carla or Juliet to come to future meetings, which I will definitely be taking them up on. So appreciate it.
Thanks for sharing that update, Grace. And I know you have to hop off, so I appreciate you staying on just a couple more minutes for that. Yeah, if folks at any time are like, oh, I need to talk to my leadership, or I need to talk to some folks internally about this, and I don't really know how to do it, or I don't want to do it alone, that's part of what our unit is for, is to help with those kinds of conversations. So to any extent that we can, let us know, and we'll gladly try and support. Going back to what Amy was saying about A&R's engagement in the core team, I don't think internally we've had a conversation about who from our team yet would be like the point person, but we'll be involved and we'll help with the coordination. So don't worry about that.
Okay, great. I think it would be helpful to determine next steps, like immediate next steps. There may be some ways to move this forward outside of these meetings without reaching quorum. So just want to give you a chance to button this up before we leave.
I mean, I feel like a next step is for each of the agencies to have a conversation internally about who, if anyone, has capacity, and if so, who that person would be. I don't know, I should know this maybe from talking with Ricardo, but how many people are engaged in the community engagement task group, and if that feels like a good size that we should be aiming for, maybe. But I don't know if it makes sense for us to have like a within the next, by the time we have another meeting as a IAC, we each will have had those conversations. I guess we're having a joint meeting in June, but so that wouldn't be till July, but setting a deadline for like a month out from now to have had those conversations and be able to kind of assess, do we have the number of people we're looking for? And if not, do we need to think about next steps for at least IAC member involvement in a task group or core team, however we want to fix it?
I'm sorry, Claire, can you clarify? It sounded at first like you were saying having internal conversations, like within each of the agencies, but then it sounded like maybe having more of a conversation continued as this group. And I just wanted to understand. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Rambling a little bit. Thinking that the first step is internal conversations. And given that government is so deadline driven, like setting a deadline by which we're all going to have those conversations, and then coming back to have a joint conversation about like, what is the outcome? And I actually don't know, that may not need to be a meeting. That could be like, by this date, have this conversation internally and email someone on the A&R team or another point person. And then we can have that assessment of like, do we have, I assume it would be like 3 to 4 people to help move this forward, or are we in need of rethinking how to do that given capacity constraints?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I want to reflect back to the group that there was a timeline that was developed. And the first task, the core team development task, which I believe is phase 0, I think was the deadline was end of June. So we may also need to revisit the timeline that's associated with the development of each of the tasks. I support, Claire, your approach of let's touch base internally. And, with regards to the number, it's very difficult to know how many folks, depending on where they're situated within the agency. It may be that one person is sufficient because they have the contacts to inform conversations that perhaps are outside the scope of their work. So it really depends on the position, the individuals hold. Another thing that I wanted to mention, Jeffrey, and welcome, and I'm very happy you're here, is that this conversation usually involves mention of your office because of the centrality of the work. So the recommendation that the advisory council provided, and really now it's become more of a request, is that a centralized intake system be created to intake, triage, and manage resolution of environmental justice complaints. And because of where your office is situated with regards to the governance structure, it's always mentioned that, you know, the person occupying your seat will be involved in the development of this central system, just because of, you know, the conversations that you can have, for example, involving budget priorities and other important values that we're looking to center. So just you know, sharing, Jeffrey, that perhaps touching base with Susanna, so that if needed, she can provide more context, but also recognizing that we're very happy to meet with you to share with you more context about this one particular action, and so that you can assess whether you have the capacity to inform this process.
Okay, sounds good. It's 12. Thank you all for a really great meeting. I know this was a lot. We covered a lot. So yeah, we'll follow up with materials and other next steps. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.
Good to see you all.
Thank you, Kim and Juliet,
Of course. Thank you, Janet.
for coordinating these meetings. Bye.
Appreciate it. Bye.